Very kind introduction. I'm going to be talking to you about data and the idea of dark clouds and dark data and the kind of darker side of data. Interesting because I'm coming at it as a data scientist. I'm a qualitative and quantitative researcher. That's the company I run. I also just want to throw in, I guess as a researcher, a lot of my research is done with universities, with medical institutions. There's certain rules and regulations that I have to adhere to. I have to respect the confidentiality, the privacy of the people that I'm researching. I have to make sure that I do no harm with my research so that in the end, their lives aren't disrupted. I'm not causing them any pain or suffering. But I'm not representative of most data scientists. In fact, the data that most companies hoard, especially data in the States, they can really do anything they want with it. And they don't have to think about your well-being or what's in your interests. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today, dark data. I want to start off with a little exercise. And I want these two lovely people, I'm sure some of them you know, but I want to kind of throw you a few questions about them. And I want you guys to stare at them, take a good look at them. And the first question I want to ask you is, how likely is it that one of these people is going to die young? Think about it. Make a judgment in your head. Who's going to die young here? Second one, do you think these people are unfaithful? Do they cheat? Which of these people is a cheater? Next one, and last one, is which of these people would be likely to kill someone? Because physical violence or aggression on someone else. Okay, thanks guys. Appreciate you standing up there. Normally in these sort of exercises, I actually get people to kind of throw out their opinions on this stuff. But again, I don't want to cause harm to anyone. The thing is, though, that actually as an audience, you should kind of be squirming a little bit because it's actually quite uncomfortable to look at people and make those judgments and make those predictions. You should feel uncomfortable as human beings. But you know what? Data doesn't. Data doesn't give a shit. Data doesn't care. It will predict and it will decide these things without conscience. And that's kind of what I want to talk to you about today. I want to talk to you about data leaks, data secrets, and data care, these three kind of broad areas. I also just want to throw in one thing, which is that I apologize. Some of these points of data in here, I use a lot of academic data, can be quite confrontational. They can kind of put people into a corner. They can stereotype. I don't mean to do that. I apologize, but that's what's kind of coming up as we go through. So the first one is data leaks. The reality is that human beings leak a ton of data. Why do we leak data? Well, because it's kind of built into us. Human beings were built to leak data. It's what we do when we socialize. It's how we build relationships with people. We share things about ourselves. They share things back. It builds bonds between us. But that also makes us incredibly vulnerable, especially in this day and age. And if you look at just pure numbers in terms of what people are leaking, 2.5 quintillion bytes a day, according to IBM, the kind of fathers of big data out there, is leaked out into the universe. 204 million emails a minute, 2 million searches a minute on Google, 284,000 updates a minute, 100,000 tweets a minute. Even the best of you out there, if you think, you know what, I don't leak that much, I'm kind of in control of everything, it's actually just not true. Research is showing that control is a finite thing. It's not infinite. You have a certain amount of control inside you, and once you use up that control, it reduces the amount of control you have for other things, which is the reason why families, when they're in low socioeconomic areas, they're not making as much money, they're so focused on trying to protect themselves with money that actually other things drop off. They haven't got enough control to focus on their exercise, to focus on sport, to focus on getting another job. They just don't have enough control. So we're weak. As human beings, we're incredibly vulnerable for leaking. And data observes. Data is constantly observing. Data is great at observing. It's what it does. This is a fun little chart which came out for Valentine's Day from Facebook. I'm sure it gave everyone a little smile, which was looking at across their membership base, their user base, the number of posts that tend to occur, and the days before and after that person enters into a relationship on their Facebook post. And essentially what it's saying is we observe when you enter into a relationship because we can see exactly what happens with your data. Ha ha ha, isn't this lovely? Don't you love us? We're part of Valentine's Day with Facebook. Also incredibly scary because data, again, is always observing. And this is the stuff they wanted you to see, that they wanted to share with you. Data also goes one step further. Data doesn't just observe, data predicts. Data can predict what will likely happen in terms of behaviours as a result of what we see, these observations. And And violence is a very interesting one. In fact, what Ryan was talking about isn't actually conceptual, it's reality right now in London. As of October, in London, they're actually testing software at the moment, purchased through Accenture, that will predict who is likely to cause and commit violent crimes within the city area. Partly combined on past public information of prosecutions, but also looking at things like, if you look at the age group of a male, majority of violence actually occurs with males between the ages of 15 to 25, so if you're in there, automatically it tags you. Then if you're one of the major causes of violence, often amongst young men, is when they feel like their ego has been brought down in front of a large group of people. So if one of those guys says something insulting or does something insulting in social media and it's picked up, then all of a sudden that's a red flag for potential violence. All of these things, again, can predict whether or not certain people are likely to then commit violence. How do you feel about that if you were tagged as one of those people by that big data? Which kind of brings me to that final point, which is that data fundamentally doesn't care about you. It doesn't care. Why doesn't it care? Well, it's a lot like money. It has an incredible amount of power over us and influence. But just like money, data is psychopathic. It has amorals. It doesn't care positively or negatively about you. It literally doesn't feel anything. Which means, when you're looking at, as an industry, money is very tightly regulated because we realize that it's amoral. And if you don't have ceilings and floors on marketplaces, crazy things happen. Same thing with data. And yet, really, there are no ceilings and floors around data, especially when you're looking at what's happening in the States. So how do I then kind of take this back to you? Because one of the big problems, I'm sure you've heard all this stuff before, you're probably thinking of Assange and Snowden and the NSA. The problem is that it's so big, so macro, that it just doesn't touch you personally. And you think, okay, yeah, maybe the government's doing this, maybe these big organizations, Google and Facebook are doing this, but how does this affect me personally? Now I'm going to make this really personal for you. I'm going to show you on the next few slides what myself, as a data researcher, someone who understands data and statistics and what to do with it, could learn about you, just an average person, by spending enough time stalking you online and finding out things and putting together the data. So that's kind of what I want to do with this. The first thing that I would do as a data scientist is I would build a psychological profile of you. In the past, as a psychologist, what you would do is you would take someone through a fairly long questionnaire. The NEO questionnaire to build a psychological profile is about 240 questions that you'd have to fill in order for me to get that. But things are changing. In fact, in the last few years, this is a great quote from some text analytic scientists, we're in the midst of a revolution whereby, for the first time, researchers can link daily word use to a broad array of real-world behaviours. The words people use provide important psychological cues to their thought process, motivations, behaviours. So actually all I need to do, any one of you, is if I can go through and I can scrape every comment you've made on Instagram, if your Facebook page is actually open, I'll scrape everything you've said in there. If you've got a blog, I'll scrape the words off that WordPress blog, or Blogspot blog, or whatever that blog is, Tumblr. I go into Twitter. If you've got Twitter, that's an absolute goldmine. That gives me so many words to play with. And I'd scrape every single one of those words. And what would I do with that? Well, I'd actually build a psychological profile. And when I talk about psychological profiles, I'm not talking about this light, fluffy Myers-Briggs or those kind of tarot card psychological profiles where you walk away and you always feel great. It's like, oh, I'm good at this, and this could go wrong, but I'll deal with it like this. No, I'm talking about a hardcore psychological profile. The kind of things that they'd use to assess whether or not an astronaut is psychologically strong enough to be able to go into space. And the way it's assessed, it's called a Big 5 personality inventory, looks at 5 major traits in a person. It looks at their extroversion, the extent to which they get emotionally involved in the world outside of them and have fun with it. Agreeableness, the extent to which they believe in other people, trust in them, get along with other people. Conscientiousness, the degree to which they see things through, they feel like they've got to get things done. Neuroticness, or neuroticism, which looks at the extent to which a person has control over their emotions and the degree to which they deal with stresses and anxieties around them. And openness, how open they are to new experiences. And all I'd need to do is look at those words that I've scraped off your profile. And it can tell me exactly how high and low you are in each of these areas and actually build a psychological profile. This study was done by Yarkoni in 2010. It looked at over 100,000 words used by over 400 bloggers, I believe. This is all you need, this little key, to be able to build psychological profiles of people. So if you're an extrovert, you will tend to not only use, but use frequently these sorts of words. Bar, drinks, restaurant, dancing, glorious, grandfather, countless, Miami, shots, girls. Very unlikely, if you have this psychological trait or high in it, to use the words cat, computer, or minor. Why? Because they're not posting photos of their cats, they're not using their computers, they're out enjoying the world. Agreeable, wonderful, togetherness, visiting, morning, spring, walked, beautiful. These are what people high in the trait for agreeableness will use. What they won't use are porn, cost, fuck. These are words that people who are agreeable don't use. People that are conscientious, less words here. They tend to use things like completed. I completed a task. I got something done. Adventure, enjoying, deck, completing the deck maybe, or finishing the PowerPoint deck. They tend to never have spelling errors. So much lower levels of spelling errors inside their text. What they won't use are things like bored, boring, stupid, boring, and desperate. Similarly, neurotic, the words they tend to use, and you see this a lot amongst Twitter users out there. Part of the reason why is maybe because of the level of neuroticism amongst them. But awful, lazy, worse, depressing, irony, terrible, stressful, horrible, annoying indicates neuroticism. What isn't? Road, visited, oldest, because they're not visiting people. They don't care about things that are old, perhaps. And openness, lastly, humans, poets, art, culture, so on and so forth. They won't use the word giveaway. This is great. I've now built a very comprehensive and detailed psychological profile of you, whether you're high or low in each of these traits. What can that tell me? Well, it tells me a lot. It actually predicts a ton of behavior in real life. Now, does this mean 100% this is going to happen to you? No. But a lot of data users don't care if it predicts it at 100%. All they care about is that it's likely. If I'm an insurance company, all I care about is it's likely. If I'm a bank, all I care about is that it's likely. So if you're high in extroversion, it's likely that you are going to be very popular amongst your social groups. It's likely that you're going to have a higher level of status amongst those social groups, so people will like you there. It's also likely that you will be considered a leader amongst those groups. So that's something I'm looking for if I'm looking to hire you. Agreeableness, if you're high in it, it predicts your likelihood to be able to do well in team environments and to work closely in a team. You're willing to sacrifice your own needs for the needs of others. If you're a charity, I'd be really interested in knowing this one too, because it predicts your likelihood of volunteering, of giving your time to other people. It also predicts, if you're low in agreeableness, your likelihood of cheating and having extramarital affairs. So that would be very interesting for spouses that are looking to potentially profile someone on Tinder, profile one of their friends on Facebook to see if they're a good match. In terms of conscientiousness, this one, if you're high in this, will predict a likelihood of job performance. It'll predict your future earnings for the rest of your life. It'll also predict your life expectancy, because people who are high in conscientiousness tend to look after their health better. They drink less, they smoke less, they look after their cardiovascular health, they sleep better, all of these things. Neuroticism, if you're high in neuroticism, things are not good for you because you have a higher likelihood of depression and anxiety, much higher rates of divorce, and you also don't deal with stress particularly well. And openness, if you are high in this, you have a greater propensity towards creativity and artistry. That's a great one for any agencies that are in the room. In terms of openness as well, if you're high in openness, it predicts a likelihood of voting left. If you're low in openness, it predicts a likelihood of voting right. And if you're also low in openness, it predicts racism as well. So all of these things would be fantastic information for political parties to have, for any sort of racist organizations to have, in fact, for anyone to have. Why wouldn't you want this data? This tells me a ton about you, and this is just from the content I've scraped off your sites and your information. I'll then also think about geographic profiling, because this adds a whole nother layer to the stuff that I know about you. How will I do this? I'd be interested in any geotagged photographs that you have. I'd love to get your postcode of where you live. If I could get that, that would really, really help me out. But if not, I'd settle with the city that you live in. This is a study, actually, it was done by Microsoft, perhaps one of the best guys out there. It's fitting that we're in Microsoft, in terms of actually asking users what's right and wrong in terms of usage of information and data. Great quote from their researchers here. While people may benefit from services that use location data, it's important to consider the privacy risks of such services. In general, when we researched people, they showed a total lack of awareness of the privacy interrelationships in their location traces, and they actually didn't know whether or not they should be sharing their locations. They didn't know what it meant. People are incredibly, as I said before, vulnerable. So what can this predict? Well, if I can get your postcode or your FSA, I would actually do a geodemographic profile of you, which maps you against every single other person in that neighbourhood. It costs about $5,000 or $10,000, depending on who you go to do this. What I can then predict with a very great degree of certainty is exactly how much money you earn within a bracket, your education level. I could also predict your attitudes in life to the things around you and what you believe. I can also predict your lifestyle and the sorts of exercises and activities that you get involved with, based purely on your postcode. Imagine adding that to everything else that I've already got from your psychological profile. I'll also add in another area, if I can't get your postcode, what would be very interesting would be just to know the region or city that you live in. And you could cross-reference your personality profile with the city, And because in general cities, people psychologically gravitate to other people that are similar. So for example, in Vancouver, in Seattle, in San Francisco, they tend to be very high in openness there. Very generally liberal attitudes, high in creativity. If you aren't high in openness and live in those cities, you tend to be very unhappy. You tend not to be able to find a lot of friends because you don't share that same personality trait. The companies that are in those cities actually share those personality traits. The leaders of companies, their personality traits have been found through studies to actually filter into the culture of the organization so that an organization has a psychological profile. And if you don't match that organization, the profile of that organization, you're not going to be happy. So I can also, with this, start to predict your level of happiness in your current life. And maybe that data could then be sold, because there's very few restrictions, to a real estate company, because I know that you're not happy at the moment, and yet you own a house, which I predicted from the previous slide. And I also know your personality. So I'm going to sell that to a real estate agent who's going to lowball you on your house because he knows or she knows that you want to get out of there pretty soon because you're not happy in the city. Next thing, I get into your photos. Photos would be a really, really fascinating one. Who can't help but post photos like this of yourself or your couple on the beach, holidaying? This one starts to get a little creepy because what I'd really be interested in here, for women, I'd actually be measuring, rule of thumb, their waist to hip ratio, this ratio here. And for guys, what we'd be interested in is your shoulder to hip ratio. What they've found with body morphology is that from the moment that you're in vitro, so when you're in your mother's stomach to when you're born, your hormone levels are set by your mother. Those hormone levels will actually translate into your body morphology at a later date and then can actually predict a whole range of your behaviors. Unconsciously, these things you'll do without really realizing it. So what we can predict here from the female side, based on that hip to waist ratio, firstly is the level of attractiveness of that person to the opposite sex, so how many people will actually be attracted to them. Second thing we can predict is the number of sexual partners that person is likely to have had or had in the future. And the other one that we can layer in there is, again, if it's a narrower waist, wider hips, they tend to cheat a lot more, those female partners. So they tend to not only cheat with more partners outside of their relationship, but they also tend to cheat with people in relationships much more often. So that would be another interesting one to profile potentially for audiences out there. For guys, similarly, in terms of that shoulder ratio, attractiveness is predicted. Similarly, number of sexual partners is also predicted. And also, again, the likelihood of cheating. The likelihood of those guys will have slept with people outside of their relationship, and also people who are already in a relationship have slept with them as well. All of these very highly correlated with these particular measures. The last one, why not? Let's look at some selfies, because these could be also fun. Unfortunately, guys don't do too well with selfies, because what I can do with that is measure their facial width to height ratio, incredibly important for measuring levels of testosterone in a male. And there's a ton of stuff, as you'll see in a second, with that. Females, there's no equivalent at the moment in terms of studies, but there's some other stuff that we'll take a little look at. So for guys, facial width. So the wider a guy's face to height ratio, the more you can predict the following things. Number one, the likelihood of committing violence and aggression, of attacking people, of being involved in violent altercations. The slimmer that ratio for a guy, the more likely you are to die by violent ends, but not actually to commit it. You can also predict quite strongly fraud. So white-collar crime, the likelihood of a person to have embezzled money, to have committed forgeries within an organisation, have stolen cash or reserves. You can also predict the liquidity of a CEO or an owner if it's a male, based on their facial width ratio, because guys with wider faces will tend to use and spend all of their cash and have very low levels of liquidity. So there's always a chance that they could go bankrupt much quicker. Also, it would be super interesting if I was in diplomatics or politics in general, going into a negotiation to get a data scientist to run this, because it actually predicts the style of negotiation of the male as well. Are they hard negotiators? Are they unlikely to make compromises? Are they unwilling to make changes and adjust according to what the other person wants? All of these things would be fascinating, I'm sure, for anyone that's going into a business with this person. On the other side, randomly, if in the photos we've got a bunch of luxury brands and items on the female, it tends to be an excellent indicator of lower levels of self-esteem and also much lower levels of satisfaction and trust within their current relationship, because it's been found that when women have those luxury items, it's often a cue to other females that they are loved by a male that loves them and that they are therefore safe and secure. So more luxury items they have, lower self-esteem. If they're wearing red, then they're likely ovulating. When women are wearing red in the upper part of their body, it correlates very strongly with ovulation, which means that they're sexually available. If you know that, and it's combined with the fact that they're perhaps low in agreeableness and also have that waist to hip ratio, then there's a good chance. I'm not going to say it, there's a good chance. Lastly, narcissism could be a great one. If we could find their signatures anywhere, larger signatures have been correlated with clinical narcissism and also later reductions in shareholder earnings for companies. A great way to study this, a fact that a lot of people don't know, if you're actually going through annual reports, take a look at the size of the CEO signature at the front. The bigger it is, get out of the company, because it tends to be that they make horrible decisions in the long run. So this was just a few things that we could predict without actually meeting you at all from anywhere. Which brings me to my last area, a couple of last slides. Data care. We've always leaked data. You've always leaked data. It's something that we've always done. It's fundamental to who we were as people. But, and there is a big but. First one, in the past, you tended to only know 150 people. That's the number of tribes when anthropologically they looked at tribes and the size they got to. They never got any bigger than 150. Once they got to 150, tribes disbanded and they actually moved into another area. And generally speaking, in terms of close relationships, it remains the number that we always had. So in the past, before the internet, before digital revolutions, we only knew about 150 people. And we were protected by social norms. A lot of this stuff that I'm talking about now, we could have still built these profiles, we could have still done these things by digging through your trash, but people don't dig through your trash because you look like a freak standing out the front on a nature strip. People will grab you and tackle you down for going through this stuff. It's not considered socially normal. So we're protected by that norm, whereas you're not protected like that on the internet. And the third one is that we were just protected by technical limits. There was no way that someone could sit around realistically recording every single word that you physically said and then analysing that for frequency against your personality profile. We didn't have the technological ability to do that, whereas we do now. Add to that fact that data just doesn't care about you. It is amoral. And it leads us to the final slide here, which is that as a researcher, I fundamentally believe this, is that we as human beings are in need of protection with data. We need protection because we're vulnerable. We can't control, and we shouldn't be expected to control all of this data. It's unreasonable to expect us to click those privacy and terms and conditions clauses and give into this data and realize what's really happening. And this picture here is a really interesting example and analogy that I want to use. Back in 1900 in America, 21.6% of American children actually were employed in factories and warehouses around America. And when you looked at industries, when industries were being talked to, industries were fighting to continue this right. Essentially what they were saying was that our growth would be impeded if you restrict our ability to have these children on these floors. In these cotton mills here, they said, adults' hands aren't quick enough to be able to do this job. We need to have children. We can't grow without it. And it's actually a very similar argument now being used by the data industry across the States, which is that in the present day, American companies seem terrified of the prospect of having some basic, fair privacy restrictions in place for users. They're terrified of it, and they say that if you try and restrict this data for us, if you try and put in privacy, it will impact our growth. It'll impact our ability and our economy. And fundamentally, it's not true. It's not true because when it comes to these sorts of issues, we as people, we as a society, have to make decisions, and we have to decide if we're comfortable with the sorts of things that I just presented there. As a researcher, I wouldn't be comfortable with it, and hopefully, as an audience, you're not comfortable with it either. So, that's it.